Question 1. The control framework reveals that the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, is considering new regulations for industrial wastewater discharge. A senior scientist within ADEM believes the scientific data strongly supports a particular set of stringent discharge limits. However, the agency's legal counsel is concerned about the time and resources required for a full public rulemaking process. What is the most appropriate course of action for ADEM to develop and implement these new regulations in Alabama? Option A. Publish the proposed discharge limits as guidance documents rather than formal regulations to expedite implementation. Option B. Consult only with a small, pre-selected group of major industrial dischargers to gather their feedback before finalizing the regulations. Option C. Initiate the formal rulemaking process under the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, including public notice, comment period, and a public hearing if necessary, before finalizing the regulations. Option D. Adopt the proposed discharge limits immediately based on the scientific data and internal review, citing the urgency of environmental protection. Correct answer is C. Initiate the formal rulemaking process under the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, including public notice, comment period, and a public hearing if necessary, before finalizing the regulations. Explanation. The control framework reveals a situation where a state agency, the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, is tasked with developing new regulations for industrial wastewater discharge. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the agency's mandate to protect public health and the environment with the need for clear, enforceable, and legally sound regulations that are developed through a transparent and participatory process. The agency must consider scientific data, economic impacts, and public input while adhering to the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act, APA. Careful judgment is required to ensure the rulemaking process is fair, efficient, and ultimately leads to effective environmental protection. The best approach involves initiating the formal rulemaking process as outlined in the Alabama Administrative Procedure Act. This includes publishing notice of the proposed rulemaking in the Alabama Administrative Monthly, providing a public comment period, holding a public hearing if requested or deemed necessary, and then considering all submitted comments before finalizing the regulations. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the statutory requirements of the APA, ensuring transparency, public participation, and due process. By following these steps, ADEM demonstrates its commitment to a legally sound and democratically accountable rulemaking process, which is essential for the legitimacy and enforceability of the new regulations. This method also allows for the incorporation of valuable feedback from stakeholders, potentially leading to more practical and effective regulations. An approach that bypasses the formal notice and comment period, proceeding directly to adoption based on internal scientific review, is professionally unacceptable. This failure violates the core principles of the APA, specifically the requirements for public notice and opportunity to be heard. Such an action would undermine public trust and could lead to legal challenges, rendering the regulations invalid. Another unacceptable approach would be to adopt regulations based solely on the recommendations of a select group of industry representatives without broader public input. While industry input is valuable, excluding other stakeholders such as environmental groups, local governments, and the general public from the formal comment process is a violation of the APA mandate for broad public participation. This could result in regulations that are perceived as biased and may not adequately address all environmental concerns. Finally, adopting regulations that are overly broad or vague, without clear definitions or measurable standards, would also be professionally unsound. While the APA requires clear notice, regulations that lack specificity can be difficult to enforce and may not achieve the intended environmental protection goals. This approach fails to provide adequate guidance to regulated entities and enforcement personnel, leading to potential confusion and inconsistent application. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to statutory requirements, such as the APA, while actively seeking and incorporating diverse stakeholder input. This involves understanding the legal framework for rulemaking, planning for adequate public engagement, and ensuring that the final regulations are clear, specific, and achievable. Question 2. What factors determine the enforceability of a proposed business agreement between an Alabama-based technology firm and a Japanese manufacturing company, where initial discussions have been enthusiastic but no formal written contract has been signed, and the deal involves significant capital investment. Option A. The commencement of preliminary work or partial performance by one party based on the informal understanding of the deal. Option B. The expressed excitement and general agreement to move forward during initial discussions, indicating a shared intent to do business. Option C. The existence of a verbal agreement accompanied by a handshake, reflecting the parties' mutual enthusiasm and intent to proceed. Option D. The presence of a clear written agreement that outlines the offer, acceptance, consideration, and all essential terms of the transaction, ensuring mutual assent. The correct answer is D. The presence of a clear written agreement that outlines the offer, acceptance, consideration, and all essential terms of the transaction, ensuring mutual assent. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the desire to secure a valuable business opportunity with the ethical and legal obligations concerning contract formation under Alabama law. Pressure to finalize a deal quickly can lead to overlooking critical steps, potentially resulting in an unenforceable agreement or reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure all elements of a valid contract are present and properly documented. The best approach involves clearly defining the terms of the agreement, ensuring mutual assent, and documenting this understanding in writing, especially given the significant value of the proposed transaction. This aligns with Alabama's general contract law principles, which require offer, acceptance, and consideration. For significant transactions, a written agreement memorializing these elements is crucial for enforceability and to prevent future disputes. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct by ensuring clarity and mutual understanding before commitments are finalized. An approach that relies solely on a verbal agreement, even with a handshake, is professionally unacceptable. While oral contracts can be valid in Alabama for certain types of agreements, the statute of frauds generally requires contracts for the sale of goods over a certain value, or agreements that cannot be performed within 1 year, to be in writing. Failing to document the terms of a substantial business deal in writing risks the contract being deemed unenforceable. Furthermore, relying on a handshake alone lacks the specificity needed to clearly establish mutual assent and the precise terms of the agreement, creating a high risk of misunderstanding and future litigation. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to proceed with partial performance based on an informal understanding without a written contract. Partial performance can sometimes validate an oral contract. It does not negate the need for clear terms and mutual assent. In this context, it could lead to disputes over what was agreed upon, the scope of obligations, and the final price, especially if the other party later disputes the terms or claims the agreement was different. This creates significant legal and financial risk. Finally, assuming the contract is formed simply because both parties express enthusiasm and agree to move forward, without a clear, written memorialization of all essential terms is also a failure. Enthusiasm does not equate to a legally binding offer and acceptance. Essential terms such as price, delivery, payment schedule, and specific deliverables must be clearly articulated and agreed upon. Without this, there is no true mutual assent, and therefore, no contract is formed under Alabama law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes clarity, documentation, and legal compliance. This involves 1. Identifying all essential terms of the proposed agreement. 2. Ensuring clear offer and acceptance, ideally in writing. 3. Verifying adequate consideration. 4. Documenting the agreement in a comprehensive written contract that reflects the mutual understanding of all parties. 5. Seeking legal counsel for complex or high-value transactions to ensure compliance with all applicable Alabama laws. Question 3. The assessment process reveals that the Prime Minister of Alabama has received substantial campaign contributions from a prominent industry group, whose members stand to benefit significantly from an upcoming infrastructure development policy currently under cabinet review. The Prime Minister believes the policy is in the best interest of Alabama and that the contributions were legal and did not influence their personal stance, yet recognizes the potential for public perception of bias. What is the most ethically sound and professionally responsible course of action for the Prime Minister to take regarding their involvement in the Cabinet's decision-making on this policy? Option A. Ignore the potential for perceived bias, focusing solely on the policy's merits and the legality of the contributions, and continue to participate fully in the Cabinet's decision-making process. Option B. Immediately disclose the campaign contributions to the Alabama Ethics Commission and recuse themselves from all discussions and voting related to the infrastructure development policy. Option C. Proceed with the policy decision as planned, asserting that the contributions were legal and did not influence their judgment, and that the policy serves the public interest. Option D. Subtly modify the policy to appear less directly beneficial to the contributing industry group, while still achieving the desired outcome, to mitigate perceived conflicts. The correct answer is B. Immediately disclose the campaign contributions to the Alabama Ethics Commission and recuse themselves from all discussions and voting related to the infrastructure development policy. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between political expediency and the ethical obligation to uphold the integrity of the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet's decision-making processes in Alabama. The Prime Minister faces pressure from influential stakeholders who have provided significant campaign contributions, creating a potential conflict of interest. Navigating this situation requires careful judgment to ensure that policy decisions are made in the public interest, free from undue influence, and in accordance with the principles of good governance expected of the executive branch. The best professional approach involves transparently disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the relevant ethics committee or oversight body within the Alabama government, and recusing oneself from any discussions or decisions directly related to the stakeholders' interests. This approach is correct because it adheres to the fundamental ethical principles of transparency, impartiality, and accountability that underpin public service in Alabama. By proactively seeking guidance and recusing from the decision-making process, the Prime Minister demonstrates a commitment to avoiding even the appearance of impropriety, thereby safeguarding the public trust and the integrity of the Cabinet's functions. This aligns with the spirit of ethical conduct expected of all public officials in Alabama, emphasizing that decisions must be based on merit and public good, not on personal or financial gain. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the policy decision without any disclosure or recusal, arguing that the contributions were legal and did not directly influence the decision. This is professionally unacceptable because it ignores the appearance of impropriety and the potential for perceived bias, even if no actual wrongdoing occurred. It fails to uphold the principle of impartiality and can erode public confidence in the executive branch. Another incorrect approach would be to subtly alter the policy to appear less favorable to the stakeholders while still ultimately benefiting them, believing this circumvents the ethical obligation. This is professionally unacceptable, as it represents a deliberate attempt to mislead and manipulate the process, undermining transparency and good governance. It is a form of ethical evasion that is detrimental to public trust. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the concerns raised by the stakeholders as mere political noise and proceed with the original policy without considering the ethical implications of the contributions. This is professionally unacceptable because it demonstrates a lack of diligence in assessing potential conflicts of interest and a disregard for the principles of ethical leadership and accountability within the Alabama executive branch. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear framework. First, identify any potential conflicts of interest, including financial or personal relationships with stakeholders. Second, consult relevant ethical guidelines and regulations specific to Alabama's executive branch. Third, seek advice from an independent ethics advisor or oversight body. Fourth, document all steps taken and decisions made. Finally, prioritize transparency and impartiality, even if it means delaying or altering a decision-making process to ensure it is free from undue influence. Question 4. The audit findings indicate that a manufacturing facility in Alabama is experiencing uncertainty regarding its compliance obligations following the enactment of new environmental legislation by Japan's national diet. The firm's Japanese parent company has provided its interpretation of the new law's implications for overseas operations. What is the most prudent course of action for the Alabama facility's management to ensure full compliance? Option A. Assume that adherence to current Alabama environmental regulations is sufficient and that the Japanese legislation has no direct impact on the Alabama facility's operations. Option B. Solely rely on the interpretation of the Japanese national diet's legislation provided by the firm's Japanese parent company for guidance on compliance in Alabama. Option C. Engage legal counsel with expertise in both Japanese corporate law and Alabama environmental regulations to interpret the National Diet's legislation and its applicability to the Alabama facility. Option D. Implement broad environmental initiatives based on a general understanding of environmental responsibility without specific legal consultation to address potential concerns from both jurisdictions. Correct answer is C. Engage legal counsel with expertise in both Japanese corporate law and Alabama environmental regulations to interpret the National Diet's legislation and its applicability to the Alabama facility. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential disconnect between the legislative intent of the National Diet in Japan and the practical implementation of a new environmental regulation affecting a major manufacturing firm in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires understanding how a foreign legislative body's laws might intersect with domestic regulatory frameworks and corporate compliance, particularly when the firm operates in a different jurisdiction, Alabama, but is influenced by the legislative actions of another, Japan's National Diet. The firm must navigate potential conflicts or ambiguities arising from this cross-jurisdictional influence, while ensuring compliance with Alabama's specific environmental laws. Careful judgment is required to identify the most appropriate compliance strategy. The best approach involves proactively seeking clarification from legal counsel specializing in both Japanese corporate law and Alabama environmental regulations. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the core of the challenge. Understanding the precise legal obligations stemming from the National Diet's legislation as it applies to operations in Alabama. Legal counsel can interpret the Japanese law's intent and scope, assess its direct or indirect applicability to the Alabama facility, and advise on how to align operations with both Japanese requirements and Alabama's environmental statutes. This ensures a comprehensive and legally sound compliance strategy, minimizing risk of penalties and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the interpretation of the Japanese National Diet's legislation, as communicated by the firm's Japanese parent company, without independent legal review in Alabama. This is professionally unacceptable because it assumes the parent company's understanding and communication of the law are accurate and fully applicable to the Alabama context. Japanese legal interpretations may not fully account for Alabama's specific environmental standards or enforcement mechanisms, leading to potential noncompliance. Another incorrect approach is to assume that compliance with Alabama's existing environmental regulations is sufficient, disregarding any new mandates from the Japanese National Diet. This is professionally unacceptable, as it ignores a potential layer of obligation. If the National Diet's legislation imposes specific operational standards or reporting requirements that go beyond Alabama's current framework, failing to address them could lead to violations of Japanese corporate governance or international agreements the firm might be party to, even if not directly enforced by Alabama authorities. A further incorrect approach would be to implement changes based on a broad understanding of environmental responsibility without specific legal guidance, hoping to satisfy both jurisdictions. This is professionally unacceptable because it lacks the precision required for legal compliance. Vague interpretations can lead to insufficient or misdirected efforts, failing to meet the specific legal requirements of either the National Diet's legislation or Alabama's environmental laws, thereby exposing the firm to legal and financial risks. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the precise legal obligations in all relevant jurisdictions. This involves identifying all applicable laws and regulations, seeking expert legal counsel for interpretation and advice, assessing the practical implications for operations, and developing a clear, documented compliance plan. When cross-jurisdictional influences are present, it is crucial to engage legal expertise that spans all relevant legal systems to ensure comprehensive and accurate compliance. Question 5. Compliance review shows that an executor in Alabama has been appointed to manage the estate of a deceased individual who passed away without a valid will. The client, who is a close friend of the deceased, is urging the executor to distribute the estate's assets to individuals they believe the deceased would have wanted to receive them, even though these individuals are not explicitly named as heirs under Alabama's intestate succession statutes. What is the most appropriate course of action for the executor to take? Option A. Delay the estate administration indefinitely until a consensus can be reached among all parties involved, including the client. Option B. Consult legal counsel in a different state to determine the best method for distributing the estate's assets. Option C. Research and strictly adhere to the Alabama Code provisions for intestate succession to identify and distribute assets to the legally recognized heirs. Option D. Prioritize the client's informal instructions and distribute the assets to the individuals the client believes the deceased would have favored. The correct answer is C. Research and strictly adhere to the Alabama Code provisions for intestate succession to identify and distribute assets to the legally recognized heirs. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating the potential conflict between a client's expressed wishes and the statutory requirements of Alabama law concerning the distribution of a deceased individual's estate. The executor must act with integrity and adhere strictly to legal mandates, even if they diverge from what the client believes is appropriate or expedient. Careful judgment is required to ensure all legal obligations are met while maintaining client trust. The correct approach involves the executor diligently researching and applying the relevant Alabama statutory law governing intestate succession. This means identifying the legal heirs according to Alabama Code, Title 43, Chapter 8, and proceeding with the distribution of the estate strictly in accordance with those provisions. This approach is correct because it directly fulfills the executor's fiduciary duty to administer the estate according to the law of Alabama, ensuring fairness and legal compliance. The Alabama Code provides a clear framework for who inherits property when a will is absent, and adherence to this framework is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to prioritize the client's informal instructions over the established statutory framework. This could involve attempting to distribute the estate to individuals not recognized as legal heirs under Alabama law, or bypassing the statutory procedures for identifying and notifying heirs. Such an approach fails to uphold the executor's legal responsibilities and could lead to legal challenges, financial penalties, and personal liability for the executor. It disregards the protective measures established by Alabama's legislature to ensure equitable distribution of assets and prevent disputes. Another incorrect approach would be to delay the administration of the estate indefinitely based on the client's vague dissatisfaction, without taking concrete steps to understand and apply the relevant Alabama statutes. This inaction, while perhaps stemming from a desire to appease the client, ultimately violates the executor's duty to administer the estate promptly and efficiently as required by law. Prolonged delays can complicate matters, increase costs, and frustrate the legal heirs. A further incorrect approach would be to seek advice from a jurisdiction other than Alabama regarding the distribution of an estate located within Alabama and governed by Alabama law. While general legal principles may be similar, the specific intestate succession statutes of Alabama are controlling. Relying on laws from another state or jurisdiction would be a direct contravention of the legal framework applicable to this estate. The professional reasoning framework that should be applied in such situations involves a multi-step process. First, identify the governing jurisdiction and its relevant statutory framework. In this case, Alabama statutory law. Second, understand the specific legal requirements and procedures mandated by that framework. Third, assess the client's request against these legal requirements. Fourth, communicate clearly and professionally with the client, explaining the legal obligations and the executor's inability to deviate from statutory mandates. Fifth, execute the estate administration strictly in accordance with the law, documenting all actions taken. Question 6. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a client in Alabama wishes to enter into a real estate purchase agreement. The client instructs their legal advisor to draft the agreement such that it omits any mention of a known, significant structural defect in the property that the client believes the buyer is unlikely to discover before closing. The client's primary concern is to finalize the sale quickly and at the agreed-upon price, without the buyer renegotiating due to the defect. What is the most appropriate course of action for the legal advisor under Alabama's general principles of civil law? Option A. Proceed with drafting the agreement as instructed, omitting any mention of the structural defect, as the client is the one directing the terms of the contract. Option B. Advise the client on the legal implications of failing to disclose the known structural defect, including potential breaches of the duty of good faith and fair dealing under Alabama law, and explore alternative contract clauses that ensure transparency while protecting the client's legitimate interests. Option C. Immediately refuse to represent the client in this matter, citing ethical concerns without further discussion or exploration of the client's intent. Option D. Draft the agreement to include a broad as-is clause, which the client believes will shield them from liability for any undisclosed defects, regardless of their knowledge. The correct answer is B. Advise the client on the legal implications of failing to disclose the known structural defect, including potential breaches of the duty of good faith and fair dealing under Alabama law, and explore alternative contract clauses that ensure transparency while protecting the client's legitimate interests. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated desire and the legal advisor's ethical and professional obligations under Alabama civil law. The advisor must navigate the client's instructions while upholding the principles of good faith, fair dealing, and the prohibition against fraudulent misrepresentation, all of which are foundational to Alabama's general principles of civil law. The advisor's duty is not merely to execute instructions, but to ensure those instructions are legally sound and ethically permissible. The best approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's request against Alabama's civil code concerning contract formation and enforcement, specifically focusing on the duty of good faith and fair dealing implied in all contracts. This approach requires the advisor to identify potential misrepresentations or omissions that could violate these principles. By advising the client on the legal ramifications of their proposed actions, including the potential for contract voidability or damages due to bad faith, and suggesting alternative, legally compliant strategies, the advisor upholds their professional responsibility. This aligns with Alabama law's emphasis on honest dealings and the prevention of unjust enrichment or harm through deceptive practices, an approach that proceeds with the client's instructions without further inquiry or counsel risks, facilitating a breach of contract or even a tortious interference claim. This fails to uphold the duty of good faith and fair dealing, which requires parties to act honestly and not to frustrate the other party's reasonable expectations. Such an action could expose both the client and the advisor to legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach involves immediately refusing to assist the client without exploring the underlying intent or potential legal avenues. While the advisor has a duty to avoid unethical conduct, a complete refusal without attempting to understand the client's objectives and offering lawful alternatives may not be the most constructive or ethically sound response, potentially abandoning the client without proper guidance. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the client's explicit instructions, ignoring the broader legal and ethical context, is deficient. Alabama civil law, like most jurisdictions, implies certain duties and obligations that transcend the literal wording of an agreement. Ignoring these implied duties can lead to unintended legal consequences. The professional reasoning framework should involve 1. Understanding the client's objective. 2. Identifying the relevant Alabama civil law principles, e.g., good faith, fair dealing, contract validity. 3. Assessing the proposed action against these principles. 4. Advising the client on legal risks and ethical considerations. 5. Proposing legally compliant alternatives if the initial request is problematic. Question 7. Compliance review shows an individual in Alabama engaged in behavior that caused significant emotional distress to another person and violated a company's internal code of conduct. The behavior was intentional, and the individual knew their actions were likely to cause distress. However, the specific act, while offensive, is not explicitly listed as a prohibited offense in the Alabama Criminal Code, nor does it carry a potential penalty of imprisonment exceeding 1 year or a fine greater than $500. Based on Alabama law, how should this behavior be classified? Option A. It should be classified as a crime because it caused emotional distress and violated a company policy. Option B. It should be classified as a crime if it meets the statutory definition of an unlawful act or omission punishable by law under Alabama Code Section 13A1-2. 1. Option C. It should be classified as a crime because the individual acted intentionally and knew their actions were likely to cause distress. Option D. It should be classified as a crime as any behavior causing harm or distress is inherently criminal. Correct answer is B. It should be classified as a crime if it meets the statutory definition of an unlawful act or omission punishable by law under Alabama Code Section 13A1-2-1. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires distinguishing between an act that is merely offensive or socially undesirable and an act that constitutes a criminal offense under Alabama law. Misinterpreting the definition of a crime can lead to improper reporting, unwarranted investigations, or a failure to protect the public interest. The core challenge lies in applying the legal definition of a crime to a specific set of facts, demanding a precise understanding of Alabama's penal code. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves meticulously examining the alleged conduct against the statutory definition of a crime as established by Alabama law. This requires identifying whether the act or omission in question meets the criteria of an unlawful act or omission that is punishable by law. Specifically, under Alabama Code Section 13A1-2-1, a crime is defined as conduct, other than a traffic offense, that is punishable by imprisonment for which the maximum term of imprisonment is greater than 1 year, or by a fine in excess of $500, or by both. Therefore, the correct approach is to determine if the described behavior fits this legal definition, considering both the act itself and its potential statutory punishment. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to label any behavior that causes harm or distress as a crime. This fails to acknowledge that not all harmful actions are criminal offenses. Many may fall under civil liability or simply be considered socially unacceptable without meeting the legal threshold for criminality. This approach ignores the specific statutory definition of a crime in Alabama. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any action prohibited by a rule or policy is a crime. While internal policies or regulations might prescribe certain behaviors, these are distinct from criminal statutes enacted by the state legislature. An action can violate a company policy without being a crime under Alabama law. A further incorrect approach is to focus solely on the intent behind an action, without considering whether the action itself, or the failure to act, is defined as a crime by Alabama statutes. While intent, mens rea, is often a crucial element in proving a crime, the act or omission actus reus must also be criminalized by law. An action with malicious intent is not automatically a crime if it does not correspond to a prohibited act or omission under the Alabama Code. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a structured decision-making framework. First, they must identify the specific conduct in question. Second, they must consult the relevant statutory definitions of a crime within the applicable jurisdiction. In this case, Alabama Code Section 13A1-2-1. Third, they must analyze whether the identified conduct precisely matches the elements of the statutory definition, considering both the act or omission and the prescribed penalties. If the conduct does not meet the statutory definition, it cannot be classified as a crime under Alabama law, regardless of its social impact or the actor's intent. Question 8. Compliance review shows that a client in Alabama has been accused of violating a statute that prohibits the unauthorized possession of certain controlled substances. The statute outlines potential penalties, including imprisonment. To properly advise the client and proceed with their defense, what is the most critical factor in determining whether this offense is classified as a felony or a misdemeanor under Alabama law? Option A. Whether the accused has any prior convictions for drug-related offenses. Option B. The maximum term of imprisonment prescribed by the statute for the offense. Option C. The common law understanding of possession offenses from historical legal texts. Option D. The perceived danger of the controlled substance to public health. The correct answer is B. The maximum term of imprisonment prescribed by the statute for the offense. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the accurate classification of a criminal act under Alabama law, which directly impacts the potential penalties, legal procedures, and the accused's rights. Misclassifying a crime can lead to significant legal and ethical repercussions, including wrongful prosecution, inadequate defense, or undue severity of punishment. The distinction between felonies and misdemeanors in Alabama is crucial for determining the appropriate course of action for legal professionals. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough examination of the specific statute allegedly violated and its corresponding classification under Alabama law. Alabama Code Section 13A1-2 defines felonies as crimes punishable by imprisonment for more than 1 year, while misdemeanors are punishable by imprisonment for 1 year or less. Therefore, the correct approach is to determine the maximum potential punishment prescribed by the statute for the alleged offense. If the statute specifies a maximum imprisonment term exceeding 1 year, it is a felony. If it specifies a maximum of 1 year or less, it is a misdemeanor. This direct application of statutory definitions ensures accurate classification and adherence to Alabama's penal code. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume the classification based on the perceived severity or societal impact of the act without consulting the specific statutory penalty. This is a failure because Alabama law strictly defines crimes by their prescribed punishments, not by subjective interpretations of their seriousness. Relying on perception can lead to misclassification and subsequent legal errors. Another incorrect approach is to classify the crime based on the defendant's prior criminal record. While a prior record can influence sentencing, it does not alter the inherent classification of the current offense as defined by the statute. Alabama law classifies crimes based on the offense itself, not the offender's history, making this approach legally unsound. A further incorrect approach is to rely on common law definitions of crimes without verifying their current status and classification under the Alabama Criminal Code. While common law may have influenced the development of Alabama's criminal statutes, the current operative definitions and classifications are found exclusively within the Alabama Code. Failure to adhere to the codified law is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should employ a systematic decision-making framework. First, identify the specific statute under which the individual is being investigated or charged. Second, consult the official Alabama Code to determine the classification of the offense as defined by its maximum penalty. Third, if ambiguity exists, seek clarification from legal precedent or supervisory counsel. This structured approach ensures that decisions are grounded in the specific legal framework of Alabama, promoting fairness and accuracy in the legal process. Question 9. Process analysis reveals that a client in Alabama is seeking to challenge a decision made by a Japanese ministry that they believe is unlawful and has caused them significant financial harm. The client wants to understand the most appropriate legal recourse within the Japanese legal system to have this administrative decision overturned. Option A. File a criminal complaint against the officials responsible for the decision within the Japanese justice system. Option B. Engage a private arbitration service in Japan to mediate a resolution with the ministry. Option C. Submit a formal complaint to the relevant oversight committee within the Japanese Diet. Option D. Initiate administrative litigation in the Japanese courts to seek judicial review of the ministry's decision. The correct answer is D. Initiate administrative litigation in the Japanese courts to seek judicial review of the ministry's decision. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of how different branches of the Japanese legal system interact and the appropriate avenues for seeking redress when a dispute arises concerning administrative actions. Misunderstanding the structure can lead to significant delays, incorrect legal strategies, and ultimately, a failure to achieve a just outcome for the client. Careful judgment is required to identify the most effective and procedurally sound path within the Japanese framework. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves recognizing that disputes concerning the legality of administrative actions in Japan are typically addressed through administrative litigation, which is a specific type of civil litigation. This process allows for judicial review of decisions made by administrative agencies. The Japanese Constitution and the Administrative Case Litigation Act provide the framework for such challenges. Therefore, advising the client to initiate administrative litigation to challenge the ministry's decision directly addresses the core issue of the legality of the administrative action within the established judicial review process. This aligns with the principle of seeking judicial remedies for grievances against governmental bodies. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the client to file a criminal complaint would be incorrect because the dispute concerns the legality of an administrative decision, not a criminal offense. Criminal proceedings are for prosecuting violations of criminal law, and there is no indication that the ministry's action constitutes a crime. Pursuing a complaint to the Diet's Oversight Committee while potentially a political avenue, is not a formal legal process for challenging the validity of an administrative decision. The Diet's role is primarily legislative and oversight, not judicial review. Furthermore, seeking mediation through a private arbitration service would bypass the established legal channels for challenging administrative actions and would likely not be binding or effective in overturning a government decision. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with legal systems like Japan's must first identify the nature of the dispute. Is it a civil matter, a criminal matter, or an administrative dispute? Once categorized, they must then identify the appropriate forum and procedure within that jurisdiction's legal framework. This involves understanding the roles of different governmental branches, legislative, executive, judicial, and the specific laws governing their interactions with citizens and entities. For administrative disputes, the key is to determine if judicial review is available and what the procedural requirements are. Question 10. The performance metrics show a significant increase in consumer complaints regarding the environmental impact of a manufacturing plant in Osaka, Japan. The company is considering investing yen 500 million in new pollution control technology. To justify this expenditure to the board, the finance department needs to project the financial impact. Assuming the investment in pollution control technology will reduce potential fines by yen 100 million annually and enhance brand reputation, leading to an estimated annual increase in sales revenue of yen 50 million, and considering a discount rate of 5%, what is the net present value, NPV, of this investment over a 10-year period? And how does this calculation reflect the broader implications of Article 29 of the Constitution of Japan regarding property rights and the public good? Option A. The NPV is approximately yen 100,000,000. This calculation focuses solely on the reduction in potential fines, ignoring the sales revenue increase and the constitutional implications of environmental stewardship. Option B. The NPV is approximately yen 430,300,000. This calculation demonstrates that the investment is financially sound and aligns with the constitutional principle of promoting the general welfare, as the projected financial benefits outweigh the costs, thereby safeguarding the company's property rights through responsible stewardship and contributing to societal well-being. Option C. The NPV is approximately yen 500,000,000. This calculation represents the initial investment cost without considering any potential returns or the constitutional imperative to balance property rights with public welfare. Option D. The NPV is approximately yen 50,000,000. This calculation only considers the projected increase in sales revenue, neglecting the initial investment cost, potential fines, and the broader constitutional context. The correct answer is B. The NPV is approximately yen 430,300,000. This calculation demonstrates that the investment is financially sound and aligns with the constitutional principle of promoting the general welfare, as the projected financial benefits outweigh the costs, thereby safeguarding the company's property rights through responsible stewardship and contributing to societal well-being. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for misinterpreting the application of Japanese constitutional principles to a modern business context, specifically concerning the financial implications of corporate social responsibility, CSR, initiatives. The difficulty lies in quantifying the impact of constitutional rights on financial projections and ensuring that investment decisions align with both legal obligations and ethical considerations as interpreted through the lens of the Japanese Constitution. Careful judgment is required to balance fiduciary duties with the broader societal expectations embedded within constitutional law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a quantitative assessment of the financial impact of proposed CSR initiatives, directly linking them to potential long-term value creation and risk mitigation, while acknowledging the constitutional framework. This approach, which involves calculating the projected return on investment (ROI) for CSR activities, considering factors like enhanced brand reputation, improved employee morale leading to higher productivity, and reduced regulatory scrutiny, aligns with the principles of sound financial management and responsible corporate governance. The Japanese Constitution, particularly Article 29 concerning the right to property and the state's role in promoting the general welfare, implicitly supports businesses acting in ways that benefit society, which can translate into tangible financial advantages. By quantifying these benefits and costs, decision-makers can demonstrate that CSR investments are not merely discretionary, but are strategically aligned with sustainable business success, thereby respecting the spirit of constitutional provisions that encourage societal well-being. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves solely focusing on the qualitative aspects of CSR and the constitutional mandate for social welfare, without a corresponding financial analysis. This fails to provide a concrete basis for investment decisions and may lead to underfunding or misallocation of resources, potentially violating fiduciary duties to shareholders. It neglects the practical need to demonstrate financial viability, which is a cornerstone of responsible business operations under any legal system, including Japan's. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss CSR initiatives entirely, arguing that they are not directly mandated by specific articles of the Japanese Constitution in a way that compels financial expenditure. This overlooks the broader interpretative scope of constitutional principles, which often inform corporate social responsibility and ethical business conduct. Such an approach risks legal challenges and reputational damage, as it fails to acknowledge the evolving understanding of corporate obligations within a constitutional democracy. A further incorrect approach is to apply a simplistic cost-benefit analysis that only considers immediate expenses without factoring in the potential long-term financial gains or risks associated with constitutional compliance and societal expectations. This narrow view can lead to short-sighted decisions that ultimately harm the company's financial health and its standing within Japanese society. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that integrates legal and ethical considerations with rigorous financial analysis. This involves 1. Identifying relevant constitutional principles and their potential implications for business operations. 2. Quantifying the financial impact of proposed actions, including both costs and projected benefits, using established financial metrics like ROI. 3. Evaluating potential risks and opportunities arising from the intersection of constitutional law and business strategy. 4. Ensuring that decisions are transparent, justifiable, and aligned with both legal obligations and the long-term sustainability of the enterprise. Question 11. Operational review demonstrates that a dispute has arisen in Mobile County, Alabama, concerning a breach of contract with damages estimated at $75,000. The plaintiff seeks monetary damages and specific performance of certain contractual obligations. Which of the following actions best reflects the appropriate initial jurisdictional step within the Alabama court system? Option A. File the complaint in the Alabama Probate Court for Mobile County, as it has jurisdiction over all matters pertaining to contracts and property. Option B. File the complaint directly with the Alabama Supreme Court, as it is the highest court and can address all types of legal disputes. Option C. File the complaint in the Alabama Circuit Court for Mobile County, as it possesses general jurisdiction over civil matters and can adjudicate claims exceeding the monetary limits of lower courts, including those involving specific performance. Option D. File the complaint in the Alabama District Court for Mobile County, as it handles a broad range of civil disputes and the monetary threshold for damages is often flexible. The correct answer is C. File the complaint in the Alabama Circuit Court for Mobile County, as it possesses general jurisdiction over civil matters and can adjudicate claims exceeding the monetary limits of lower courts, including those involving specific performance. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a thorough understanding of the Alabama court system's hierarchical structure and the specific jurisdictional limitations of each court level. Misunderstanding these boundaries can lead to significant procedural errors, wasted resources, and potential dismissal of a case, impacting client trust and professional reputation. Careful judgment is required to correctly identify the appropriate venue for a legal matter. The best professional practice involves accurately assessing the nature of the dispute and the relief sought to determine the proper court of original jurisdiction within Alabama. This approach ensures that the case is initiated in the court equipped to handle its subject matter and monetary value, thereby respecting the established hierarchy and procedural rules. For instance, If a case involves a claim exceeding the monetary jurisdiction of a district court, but does not fall under the exclusive jurisdiction of a higher court, initiating it in the circuit court is the correct procedural step. This aligns with Alabama Code Title 12, Chapter 12, which outlines the jurisdiction of the circuit courts as courts of general jurisdiction, capable of hearing most civil and criminal cases, including those with higher monetary claims than those handled by district courts. An incorrect approach would be to file a case seeking damages significantly above the statutory limit for small claims in a district court. This fails to recognize the monetary limitations explicitly defined for district courts in Alabama Code Title 12, Chapter 12, Section 12-12-70, which restricts their civil jurisdiction to cases where the amount in controversy does not exceed a specified sum. Another incorrect approach would be to file a case involving a complex property dispute that falls under the exclusive jurisdiction of the circuit court in the probate court. Probate courts in Alabama, as defined in Alabama Code Title 12, Chapter 10, have specific jurisdiction primarily related to estates, wills, and guardianships, and generally lack the authority to adjudicate broad property disputes. Finally, initiating a case that clearly falls within the original jurisdiction of a lower court, such as a minor traffic infraction, directly in the Alabama Supreme Court would be an egregious error. The Alabama Supreme Court, as established by Alabama Code Title 12, Chapter 3, primarily exercises appellate jurisdiction and original jurisdiction only in very specific limited circumstances, not applicable to routine civil or criminal matters. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear identification of the legal issue, the parties involved, and the relief sought. This should be followed by a meticulous review of the Alabama Code and relevant case law to ascertain the specific jurisdictional boundaries of each court level. When in doubt, consulting with experienced colleagues or legal research resources is paramount to ensure the correct venue is selected, thereby upholding procedural integrity and effectively serving the client's interests. Question 12. Cost-benefit analysis shows that understanding the foundational principles of the Japanese legal system is crucial for advising clients with interests in Japan. Considering the distinct nature of Japan's civil law tradition compared to Alabama's common law framework, which of the following approaches best ensures competent and ethical representation for a client seeking advice on a matter governed by Japanese law? Option A. Assume that the core principles of Alabama law are sufficiently analogous to be applied directly to the Japanese legal context. Option B. Consult with a legal professional qualified and experienced in Japanese law to ensure accurate and compliant advice. Option C. Base advice on informal discussions with colleagues who have previously handled matters involving Japanese legal issues. Option D. Rely exclusively on general legal research databases and textbooks without seeking specialized foreign legal expertise. The correct answer is B. Consult with a legal professional qualified and experienced in Japanese law to ensure accurate and compliant advice. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complexities of cross-border legal systems, specifically understanding the fundamental differences between the Japanese civil law system and the common law system prevalent in Alabama. Misinterpreting the foundational principles of the Japanese legal system could lead to incorrect legal advice, potentially causing significant financial and legal repercussions for clients. The challenge lies in applying general legal knowledge to a specific, distinct jurisdiction without direct experience or specialized training in Japanese law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves recognizing the limitations of one's expertise and proactively seeking specialized knowledge. This means consulting with a legal professional who is qualified and experienced in Japanese law. This approach is correct because it upholds the ethical duty to provide competent representation. Alabama's rules of professional conduct, while not directly governing Japanese law, implicitly require lawyers to act with diligence and competence, which includes understanding the scope of their knowledge and seeking assistance when necessary. Relying on a specialist ensures that the advice provided is accurate, compliant with Japanese legal principles, and protects the client from potential errors arising from a lack of specific jurisdictional knowledge. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that the principles of Alabama law can be directly applied to a Japanese legal matter. This fails to acknowledge the fundamental differences between civil law systems, like Japan's, and common law systems, like Alabama's. Japanese law is heavily codified, with statutes forming the primary source of law, whereas Alabama law relies more on judicial precedent. Applying Alabama legal concepts without understanding their Japanese equivalents would likely lead to flawed analysis and incorrect advice. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on general legal research without consulting a Japanese law specialist. While research is a crucial part of legal practice, it can be insufficient when dealing with a foreign legal system. The nuances of interpretation, specific procedural rules, and cultural legal context are often best understood by those with direct experience and training in that jurisdiction. This approach risks overlooking critical distinctions and misinterpreting the intent and application of Japanese statutes. A third incorrect approach is to provide advice based on anecdotal information or the experiences of others who have dealt with Japanese legal matters. This is professionally unacceptable as it lacks a systematic, evidence-based foundation. Legal advice must be grounded in the actual laws and regulations of the relevant jurisdiction, not on hearsay or generalized assumptions. This approach is ethically unsound as it prioritizes expediency over accuracy and client protection. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client welfare and ethical obligations. This involves 1. Identifying the jurisdictional scope of the legal issue. 2. Assessing personal expertise and knowledge gaps regarding the relevant foreign jurisdiction. 3. Recognizing the ethical imperative to provide competent advice, which may necessitate seeking external expertise. 4. Proactively consulting with or referring the client to a qualified specialist in the foreign jurisdiction. 5. Maintaining clear communication with the client about the limitations of one's expertise and the steps being taken to ensure accurate advice. Question 13. The risk matrix shows a potential conflict of interest for a licensed Alabama real estate broker who is also a member of the Alabama Real Estate Commission. The broker's firm is currently seeking approval for a new development project that requires specific zoning variances, which are subject to the Commission's oversight and potential influence. Which of the following actions best upholds ethical and regulatory standards in this situation? Option A. The broker recusses themselves from all Commission discussions and votes pertaining to zoning variances and development projects that could directly or indirectly impact their firm's interests. Option B. The broker actively participates in Commission meetings, arguing that their industry experience is crucial for making informed decisions on such matters. Option C. The broker privately consults with other Commission members to advocate for their firm's project before formal discussions begin. Option D. The broker abstains from voting on their firm's specific project, but remains engaged in all other Commission deliberations. The correct answer is A. The broker recusses themselves from all Commission discussions and votes pertaining to zoning variances and development projects that could directly or indirectly impact their firm's interests. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a potential conflict of interest for a licensed Alabama real estate broker who also serves on the Alabama Real Estate Commission. This scenario is professionally challenging because the broker's dual role creates a direct incentive to influence Commission decisions in a manner that benefits their private business, potentially at the expense of fair market practices or consumer protection. Careful judgment is required to uphold the integrity of both their brokerage and the regulatory body. The best professional approach involves recusal from any Commission discussions or votes where their private business interests could be perceived as influencing the outcome. This aligns with Alabama's administrative law principles and ethical standards for public officials, which mandate impartiality and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. Specifically, Alabama Code Section 36-25-13 prohibits public officials from using their official position to secure a privilege or advantage for themselves or others that is not available to the general public. By recusing themselves, the broker demonstrates adherence to these principles, ensuring that Commission decisions are made based on the public good and the regulatory mandate, rather than personal financial gain. An incorrect approach would be to participate in Commission discussions and votes, arguing that their expertise as a broker is essential for informed decision-making. This fails to acknowledge the appearance of impropriety and the potential for bias, violating the spirit and letter of conflict of interest regulations. Another incorrect approach is to delegate their voting authority to another commission member without full disclosure and justification, as this does not absolve them of the underlying conflict and may still create an appearance of undue influence. Finally, attempting to subtly steer discussions or influence outcomes through informal channels without formal recusal also represents a failure to uphold ethical standards and regulatory requirements for transparency and impartiality. Professionals facing similar situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, impartiality, and adherence to ethical codes and relevant statutes. This involves proactively identifying potential conflicts, seeking guidance from legal counsel or ethics officers when necessary, and implementing clear procedures for recusal or disclosure to maintain public trust and regulatory integrity. Question 14. Governance review demonstrates that a client of a financial advisory firm in Alabama has been discussing a recent dispute with a neighbor. The client expresses satisfaction that they have been teaching the neighbor a lesson by repeatedly playing loud music late at night, knowing it disrupts the neighbor's sleep, and has also mentioned accidentally allowing their dog to enter the neighbor's yard multiple times, causing damage to the neighbor's prize-winning flowers. A financial advisor, while not a legal professional, is concerned about the potential for these actions to constitute tortious conduct under Alabama law. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Inform the client that their actions are clearly illegal and that they should immediately cease all such activities to avoid any legal repercussions. Option B. Advise the client that their actions could potentially lead to legal liability for nuisance and trespass under Alabama law, and strongly recommend they consult with an attorney in Alabama to understand their legal exposure and options. Option C. Offer to draft a letter to the neighbor on behalf of the client, explaining the client's perspective and attempting to mediate the dispute, thereby avoiding the need for legal counsel. Option D. Ignore the client's statements, as these are personal matters unrelated to financial advice, and focus solely on investment strategies. The correct answer is B. Advise the client that their actions could potentially lead to legal liability for nuisance and trespass under Alabama law, and strongly recommend they consult with an attorney in Alabama to understand their legal exposure and options. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the potential for financial gain with the ethical and legal obligations to avoid causing harm. A financial advisor must act with prudence and diligence, recognizing that their actions or inactions can have significant consequences for clients. The core of the challenge lies in discerning when a client's actions, even if seemingly minor, could expose them to tort liability under Alabama law, and what the advisor's duty is in such circumstances. The best professional approach involves a proactive and informative stance. This means recognizing that while an advisor is not a legal expert, they have a duty to observe and, where appropriate, gently guide clients away from potentially harmful activities. This approach prioritizes client well-being and risk mitigation by encouraging the client to seek independent legal counsel when a situation appears to tread into tortious conduct. This aligns with the general principles of tort liability in Alabama, which focus on duty, breach, causation, and damages. By advising the client to consult an attorney, the advisor is fulfilling a duty of care by flagging a potential legal risk without overstepping their own professional boundaries or providing legal advice. This is ethically sound as it empowers the client to make informed decisions with proper legal guidance. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the client's statements or actions, assuming they are not serious or that it is not the advisor's concern. This failure to acknowledge a potential tortious act, even if indirect, could be seen as a breach of the advisor's duty of care if it leads to foreseeable harm to the client or others. Alabama tort law emphasizes the foreseeability of harm. Another incorrect approach would be to offer legal advice directly. This is problematic because financial advisors are not licensed to practice law. Providing legal opinions or strategies would constitute the unauthorized practice of law, which is illegal and unethical, and could lead to significant liability for the advisor and potentially invalidate any advice given. Furthermore, bypasses the necessary expertise of a qualified legal professional, potentially leading the client to make detrimental decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate legal understanding. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a framework of observation, identification of potential risks, and appropriate referral. First, Advisors should remain observant of client activities and statements that might indicate potential legal exposure. Second, upon identifying such a risk, they should consider the general principles of tort liability relevant to Alabama law, such as negligence, trespass, or defamation, without attempting to make a definitive legal judgment. Third, the most prudent and ethical course of action is to advise the client to seek independent legal counsel from a qualified attorney in Alabama to assess the situation and understand their legal rights and obligations. This ensures the client receives accurate legal guidance, while the advisor stays within their professional and ethical boundaries. Question 15. Regulatory review indicates that an attorney in Alabama, representing a client in a civil lawsuit, has discovered a document produced by the opposing party during discovery that could significantly benefit their client's case. The attorney suspects the opposing party may not have intended to produce this document and might seek its exclusion if they realize it has been produced. What is the most appropriate course of action for the attorney to take under Alabama law and professional ethics? Option A. Promptly notify opposing counsel of the inadvertent production of the document. Option B. Immediately file the document with the court to ensure its preservation and potential admissibility. Option C. Wait for the opposing party to discover the document is in the attorney's possession and then argue for its admissibility. Option D. Conceal or destroy the document to prevent the opposing party from seeking its exclusion. The correct answer is A. Promptly notify opposing counsel of the inadvertent production of the document. Explanation. Regulatory review indicates that a junior associate in an Alabama law firm, representing a client in a civil litigation matter, has discovered a potentially crucial piece of documentary evidence that was inadvertently produced by the opposing party during discovery. This evidence, if admitted, could significantly bolster the associate's client's case. However, the associate also recognizes that the opposing party's counsel may not have intended to produce this document and might seek to have it excluded if they become aware of its production. This scenario is professionally challenging because it pits the associate's duty to zealously represent their client and present all favorable evidence against the ethical considerations of potentially exploiting an opponent's mistake and the rules governing discovery and evidence in Alabama. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing obligations. The best professional approach involves promptly notifying opposing counsel of the inadvertent production of the document. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principles of fairness and candor in litigation, as well as specific Alabama rules of civil procedure. Rule 26b(5)(b) of the Alabama Rules of Civil Procedure concerning the inadvertent production of privileged or protected information, while not directly applicable to non-privileged but strategically important documents, reflects a broader ethical expectation of good faith in discovery. Furthermore, ethical rules in Alabama, such as those found in the Alabama Rules of Professional Conduct, generally require lawyers to be truthful and to avoid misleading the court or opposing parties. By disclosing the discovery of the document, the associate upholds these ethical standards and allows opposing counsel the opportunity to address the situation, thereby fostering a more professional and less contentious litigation environment. This proactive disclosure also mitigates the risk of the evidence being excluded later on grounds of unfair surprise or improper discovery tactics, should the opposing party discover the associate's possession of the document through other means. An incorrect approach would be to immediately file the document with the court without informing opposing counsel. This is professionally unacceptable because it violates the duty of candor and fairness. It could be construed as an attempt to gain an unfair advantage by exploiting an opponent's error, potentially leading to sanctions or the exclusion of the evidence by the court. Another incorrect approach is to wait for the opposing party to discover the document is in the associate's possession and then argue for its admissibility. This approach is also professionally flawed as it delays the resolution of the discovery issue and can be seen as a lack of good faith in the discovery process. Finally, destroying or concealing the document would be a severe ethical violation, constituting obstruction of justice and a breach of professional conduct, with potentially severe consequences for the associate and the firm. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and adherence to procedural rules. This involves first identifying the relevant rules of civil procedure and professional conduct, then assessing the potential impact of the evidence and the implications of various actions. The framework should guide the professional to choose the path that upholds integrity, fairness, and the spirit of the law, even when a more advantageous but ethically questionable path might seem tempting. In this instance, the framework would lead to the conclusion that open communication with opposing counsel is the most responsible and ethically sound course of action. Question 16. Performance analysis shows that a Japanese corporation operating in Alabama is adhering to certain business practices that, while common in Japan, appear to conflict with a specific Alabama state regulation concerning environmental impact assessments for new industrial facilities. The United States has ratified a bilateral treaty with Japan that includes provisions aimed at facilitating trade and investment by harmonizing certain regulatory approaches, though it does not explicitly detail environmental assessment procedures. How should an Alabama-based legal counsel advise the Japanese corporation regarding the potential conflict between the treaty and the state regulation? Option A. Advise the corporation that ratified treaties, when properly implemented into U.S. law, generally supersede conflicting Alabama state regulations, and therefore the treaty provisions should be carefully examined for any implicit or explicit guidance that might affect the application of the Alabama regulation. Option B. Advise the corporation to ignore the treaty entirely, as bilateral trade agreements typically do not override specific state-level environmental regulations designed to protect local interests. Option C. Advise the corporation that Japanese domestic law regarding environmental assessments should be followed, as the corporation is a Japanese entity, and its home country's laws should take precedence in its operational conduct. Option D. Advise the corporation to strictly comply with the Alabama state regulation, as state laws are the primary governing authority for businesses operating within Alabama's borders, regardless of international agreements. The correct answer is A. Advise the corporation that ratified treaties, when properly implemented into U.S. law, generally supersede conflicting Alabama state regulations, and therefore the treaty provisions should be carefully examined for any implicit or explicit guidance that might affect the application of the Alabama regulation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of how international legal principles, specifically treaty obligations, interact with domestic Alabama law concerning Japanese business practices. The challenge lies in discerning the primacy of obligations when a conflict appears to arise, necessitating a nuanced application of legal reasoning rather than a simple adherence to one set of rules. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with both international commitments and state-specific regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves recognizing that ratified international treaties, when properly implemented into domestic law, generally supersede conflicting state laws in Alabama. This approach prioritizes the established legal framework for international relations and treaty adherence. The justification lies in the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, Article VI, which establishes treaties as the supreme law of the land, provided they are self-executing or have been implemented by Congress. In the context of Alabama, this means that if a treaty to which the United States is a party addresses business practices and has been incorporated into federal law, it would likely take precedence over a conflicting Alabama statute or regulation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on Alabama state statutes and regulations without considering the potential impact of international treaties. This fails to acknowledge the hierarchy of laws established by the U.S. Constitution, which integrates international obligations into the domestic legal system. Such an approach risks violating federal law and international commitments. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that Japanese domestic law directly applies to business operations within Alabama. While understanding foreign legal systems is important for international business, Alabama is governed by U.S. federal and state law. Japanese law would only be relevant if it were incorporated into a treaty or agreement that has been recognized and implemented under U.S. law. A further incorrect approach would be to disregard the treaty obligation entirely, arguing that state law is paramount. This ignores the constitutional framework that grants treaties the status of supreme law and would lead to a violation of U.S. international obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a hierarchical legal analysis. First, identify the relevant U.S. federal laws and international treaties to which the United States is a party. Second, determine if these treaties have been self-executing or implemented through federal legislation. Third, assess whether any Alabama state statutes or regulations conflict with these federal laws or treaty provisions. If a conflict exists and the treaty provision is properly incorporated into U.S. law, the treaty obligation generally prevails. This systematic approach ensures compliance with the highest applicable legal authority. Question 17. Market research demonstrates a growing demand for a new service within the city of Mobile, Alabama. While the Alabama state legislature has established regulations for this service, the city of Mobile has also enacted a local ordinance that imposes additional licensing and operational requirements beyond those specified by state law. A firm considering offering this service needs to determine its compliance obligations. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with all applicable legal requirements in this scenario? Option A. Rely on informal advice from local business contacts regarding the interpretation and enforceability of the City of Mobile's ordinance to guide operational decisions. Option B. Disregard the City of Mobile's local ordinance, believing it to be an unnecessary impediment to business operations that does not align with state-level regulations. Option C. Proceed with operations based solely on the Alabama state statutes, assuming that state law preempts any conflicting or additional local ordinances. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of both the relevant Alabama state statutes and the specific local ordinances of the City of Mobile, consulting with legal counsel experienced in Alabama municipal law and the relevant industry to ensure full understanding and adherence to all mandates. Correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of both the relevant Alabama state statutes and the specific local ordinances of the City of Mobile, consulting with legal counsel experienced in Alabama municipal law and the relevant industry to ensure full understanding and adherence to all mandates. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex interplay between state law and local ordinances, particularly when those ordinances may appear to conflict with or add requirements beyond state-level regulations. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for non-compliance, which can lead to penalties, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. Understanding the hierarchy of laws and the specific scope of local authority is paramount. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of the relevant Alabama state statutes governing the industry in question, alongside a precise examination of the specific local ordinances enacted by the City of Mobile. This approach prioritizes understanding the full legal landscape, including any local amendments or additional requirements that might apply. By consulting with legal counsel specializing in Alabama municipal law and the relevant industry, a firm can ensure accurate interpretation and compliance with both state and local mandates. This proactive and informed strategy minimizes risk and upholds professional integrity. An incorrect approach would be to assume that state law supersedes all local ordinances without verification. This overlooks the fact that municipalities in Alabama are granted significant authority to enact ordinances that regulate local matters, provided they do not conflict with state law or the state constitution. Relying solely on state law without investigating local ordinances could lead to violations of Mobile's specific requirements, resulting in fines or other enforcement actions. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to disregard the local ordinance entirely based on a belief that it is overly burdensome or unnecessary. While the ordinance may present challenges, its validity and enforceability are determined by its compliance with state law and the Alabama Constitution. Ignoring it without legal challenge or clarification is a direct contravention of the principle of adhering to all applicable laws and regulations. Furthermore, a flawed strategy would be to proceed with operations based on an informal understanding or opinion from a non-legal source regarding the ordinance's applicability. This lacks the rigor and certainty required for legal compliance. Professional decision-making in such situations should follow a structured process. First, identify all potentially applicable laws and ordinances. Second, seek expert legal counsel for interpretation and guidance. Third, develop a compliance strategy based on that advice. And finally, implement and monitor adherence to the established strategy. Question 18. Compliance review shows that a 17-year-old individual in Alabama operating a small online retail business under a registered trade name as a sole proprietorship has entered into a significant supply agreement with a new vendor. The agreement was signed by the minor using the business's trade name. the vendor is now seeking to enforce the terms of the agreement. Considering Alabama law, what is the most appropriate assessment of the situation regarding legal personality and capacity? Option A. The minor lacks the legal capacity to enter into a binding contract, and the sole proprietorship does not possess separate legal personality, meaning the contract is likely voidable by the minor. Option B. The sole proprietorship, by virtue of its registered trade name, has acquired separate legal personality, making the contract binding on the business entity regardless of the owner's age. Option C. The vendor can enforce the contract against the business's assets, as the trade name creates a distinct legal entity separate from the minor owner. Option D. The contract is immediately binding on the minor because the business is operational and generating revenue, demonstrating sufficient maturity to contract. Correct answer is A. The minor lacks the legal capacity to enter into a binding contract, and the sole proprietorship does not possess separate legal personality, meaning the contract is likely voidable by the minor. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating the nuances of legal personality and capacity within the specific context of Alabama law, particularly concerning a minor's ability to enter into binding agreements. The core issue is determining whether the minor, due to their age, possesses the legal capacity to be bound by the contract, and if the entity they represent, a sole proprietorship, has a distinct legal personality that could be held liable independently of the individual. Alabama law, like most jurisdictions, distinguishes between the legal personality of individuals and entities and places limitations on the contractual capacity of minors. The correct approach involves recognizing that a sole proprietorship in Alabama does not possess separate legal personality from its owner. Therefore, any contractual obligations would fall upon the individual owner. Furthermore, Alabama law generally holds that contracts entered into by minors are voidable at the minor's discretion, with limited exceptions for necessities. This approach correctly identifies that the minor lacks the legal capacity to bind themselves to the contract, and that the business structure itself does not shield the individual from this incapacity. The legal justification stems from Alabama Code, Title 26, Infants and Incompetence, and general principles of contract law regarding the capacity of minors and the nature of sole proprietorships. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the sole proprietorship, as a business name, creates a separate legal entity capable of entering into contracts independently of the owner. This fails to acknowledge that in Alabama, a sole proprietorship is not a distinct legal person. Another incorrect approach would be to treat the contract as immediately binding on the minor, overlooking the voidable nature of contracts entered into by minors under Alabama law. This disregards the protective provisions designed to safeguard minors from improvident agreements. A further incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the business's operational success without considering the underlying legal capacity of the individual owner to enter into such agreements. This prioritizes commercial outcomes over fundamental legal requirements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the parties involved and their legal status. This includes determining if the business is a sole proprietorship, partnership, corporation, or other entity, and understanding the implications for legal personality. Subsequently, the capacity of the individuals acting on behalf of any entity, or as individuals, must be assessed, paying close attention to age, mental competence, and any other legal limitations. Finally, the nature of the agreement and its enforceability under the relevant jurisdiction's laws, such as Alabama statutes concerning minors and contracts, must be thoroughly evaluated. Question 19. Compliance review shows that the Prime Minister of Japan is considering a significant shift in trade policy that could impact several key industries. The Prime Minister believes this change is critical for long-term economic growth, but anticipates potential opposition from some ministers. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Prime Minister to ensure this policy is implemented effectively and in accordance with Japanese governance principles? Option A. Delegate the final decision-making authority for this policy shift to the administrative vice ministers of the most relevant ministries. Option B. Convene a formal cabinet meeting to present the proposed policy, explain its rationale, and engage in a comprehensive discussion with all ministers to seek collective agreement. Option C. Issue a direct order to the relevant ministries to begin implementing the new trade policy immediately, citing the urgency of the economic situation. Option D. Consult informally with a few key ministers, whose portfolios are most affected to gauge their support before instructing the ministries to proceed. Correct answer is B. Convene a formal cabinet meeting to present the proposed policy, explain its rationale, and engage in a comprehensive discussion with all ministers to seek collective agreement. Explanation. The scenario presents a challenge in navigating the Prime Minister's authority within the Japanese cabinet's decision-making process, particularly when dealing with a significant policy shift that has potential implications for international relations and domestic economic stability. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the Prime Minister's directive is executed in a manner that respects the established norms of collective responsibility and the consultative nature of cabinet deliberations, while also acknowledging the Prime Minister's ultimate leadership role. Careful judgment is required to balance decisive action with adherence to the principles of good governance. The best approach involves the Prime Minister initiating a formal cabinet meeting to present the proposed policy shift, clearly articulating the rationale and expected outcomes, and facilitating a thorough discussion among all ministers. This approach is correct because it upholds the principle of collective responsibility enshrined in the Japanese Constitution and the Cabinet Law. Article 66 of the Constitution states that the Cabinet, in the exercise of executive power, shall be collectively responsible to the Diet. This implies that significant policy decisions should be deliberated and agreed upon by the Cabinet as a whole, not unilaterally dictated. The Prime Minister, as the head of the Cabinet, has the prerogative to propose policies, but the process demands consultation and consensus building to ensure all ministerial perspectives are considered and to maintain the integrity of the Cabinet's unified stance. This consultative process also allows for the identification and mitigation of potential risks or unintended consequences, thereby strengthening the policy's foundation. An incorrect approach would be for the Prime Minister to issue a directive to the relevant ministries to implement the policy change without prior consultation or formal approval from the Cabinet. This bypasses the established mechanism for collective decision-making and undermines the principle of Cabinet solidarity. It risks creating internal dissent, weakening the government's unified front, and potentially leading to policy incoherence. Ethically, it fails to respect the roles and responsibilities of other Cabinet members. Another incorrect approach would be for the Prime Minister to rely solely on informal discussions with a select few senior ministers to gain approval before instructing the ministries. While informal consultations can be a part of the process, they cannot substitute for the formal deliberation and decision-making of the entire Cabinet. This approach risks excluding crucial perspectives, creating an appearance of favoritism or undue influence, and failing to meet the constitutional requirement of collective responsibility. A final incorrect approach would be for the Prime Minister to delegate the decision-making authority entirely to the relevant ministry's administrative vice minister, without any direct involvement or clear directive from the Prime Minister or Cabinet. This abdicates the Prime Minister's leadership responsibility and the Cabinet's collective accountability for executive action. It could lead to a policy being implemented without proper political oversight or alignment with the government's broader agenda. The professional reasoning framework for such situations should prioritize adherence to constitutional and legal frameworks governing the executive branch. Professionals should always seek to understand and apply the principles of collective responsibility and accountability. When faced with policy decisions, the process should involve clear communication, thorough consultation with all relevant stakeholders within the Cabinet, and formal decision-making mechanisms. The Prime Minister's leadership is crucial, but it must be exercised within the established structures of governance to ensure legitimacy, effectiveness, and public trust. Question 20. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to accurately project the final budgetary allocation for a new high-speed rail project in Japan, following proposed amendments during the National Diet's budget review. The initial proposed budget is yen 10 trillion. Two amendments have been formally introduced. Amendment A proposes an increase of yen 500 billion, requiring a simple majority vote. Amendment B proposes a decrease of yen 300 billion, but requires a two-thirds majority vote of the total 722 members of the National Diet to pass. If Amendment A receives 362 votes and Amendment B receives 481 votes, what is the projected final budgetary allocation for the project? Option A, yen 10 trillion. Option B, yen 7 trillion. Option C, yen 2 trillion. Option D, yen 5 trillion. The correct answer is C. Yen 10, 2 trillion. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex legislative process of Japan's national diet, specifically concerning the allocation of budgetary resources for a new infrastructure project. The challenge lies in accurately calculating the potential impact of proposed amendments on the final budget, ensuring compliance with established fiscal procedures, and understanding the implications of different voting thresholds. Careful judgment is required to interpret the nuances of diet procedures and their financial consequences. The correct approach involves a precise calculation of the total budgetary impact of the proposed amendments, considering the weighted voting structure and the required supermajority for certain budgetary adjustments. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the quantitative aspects of the legislative decision-making process. The calculation must accurately reflect the percentage of the total budget each amendment represents and the number of votes needed to pass, adhering to the National Diet Standing Orders and the Public Finance Law of Japan. Specifically, understanding that a two-thirds majority is often required for significant budgetary shifts is crucial. The calculation would involve total budgetary allocation equals base budget plus Amendment 1 impact asterisk vote count 1 plus Amendment 2 impact asterisk vote count 2 plus, where vote count is 1 if the amendment passes and 0 if it fails, and the passing threshold is determined by the specific type of amendment and the Diet's rules. An incorrect approach would be to simply sum the proposed amendment amounts without considering the voting thresholds or the potential for amendments to be rejected. This fails to acknowledge the procedural realities of the National Diet, where not all proposed changes are automatically enacted. It ignores the critical requirement for a supermajority for certain financial decisions, leading to an inaccurate projection of the final budgetary outcome. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the number of Diet members supporting each amendment, without quantifying the financial impact of those amendments. While political support is a factor, the core of the budgetary decision lies in the monetary value of the proposed changes and whether they meet the legal requirements for passage. This approach neglects the mathematical and fiscal dimensions of the legislative process. A further incorrect approach would be to estimate the budgetary impact based on general trends or past similar projects, rather than performing a specific calculation based on the current proposals and the Diet's voting rules. This lacks the precision required for financial planning and legislative analysis, potentially leading to significant miscalculations and misinformed decisions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes quantitative analysis and adherence to procedural rules. This involves 1. Clearly identifying all proposed amendments and their individual financial implications. 2. Researching and understanding the specific voting thresholds required for each type of budgetary amendment within the National Diet. 3. Performing precise calculations to determine the potential final budget under various voting scenarios. 4. Cross-referencing calculations with relevant Japanese fiscal laws and diet regulations. 5. Communicating the findings clearly, highlighting the range of possible outcomes based on the voting process.